I'd like to welcome you all to the third of the Ulam lectures. The speaker after the last two nights obviously needs no introduction. I'll just give a brief comment. The reason I mentioned that I'm at the Natural History Museum in Washington is that about 12 years ago I had a postdoc, a guy named Tom Olszewski, and we were doing a project analyzing a lot of fossil data from down in West Texas. And Tom had spent about 10 months counting 750,000 shells, which tells you something about Tom, that he would do that. And then we started analyzing the data, and he came in one day and told me about this great new technique he just developed, and he was all excited about using it to analyze the data, and went off to write a paper about it. He came in and about 2 weeks later into my office and plopped down in my chair, very morose. I said, "Tom, what's wrong?" He said, "That damn Bob May. Is there anything he hasn't done?" Tom had just discovered that Bob had invented the same technique and published it in the early 1970s. So with that, Robert May and Toward Tomorrow's World.
I'm going to begin in a slightly curious way because to cure myself of an embarrassment largely, I had the pleasure and privilege that Murray Gell-Mann gave to me this morning, and which he promised to do, an essay he wrote 16 years ago on the basic issue I talked about in the first lecture on the and it's a paper which, if it isn't on the SFI website, certainly I'm sure will be tomorrow, and I commend it to you very highly because it's far and away the best thing I've read on the subject. I'm not going to make an attempt to summarize it, but one of the amusing things about it, Murray uses a very clever way of thinking about would inhabitants of other populated planets use the same sort of mathematics? Would they see the same sort of rules? And I won't give away the end of the essay, but it just so happens that he clearly invented this idea of thinking of other planets, because that's the way I'm going to end this lecture. So I got my acknowledgement in first. What I'm actually going to do in this lecture, sorry, I didn't press it hard enough the first time. First, I'm going to give an overview of the impact humanity is having, just in very general terms and very briefly. And then I'm going to turn to the components of that, which are partly more people and partly more impact per person. And there are quite a few aspects of the more people bit about which people have misconceptions, and I will try and eradicate those. And on the topic of more impact per person, there are a very large number of issues one could discuss, and I'm going just to mention three that tend to be discussed quite a bit these days: infectious disease, new and emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, food and water, and the diversity of other things. And then I'm going to end by inflicting on you some opinions about the problems we face in the world that we are headed towards at the moment. So just the overview. Over the past 150 years, the human population has increased sevenfold. And the global average energy use per person, which of course varies hugely from place to place, but as a global average has also increased by a factor 7. So overall, the footprint, as measured in energy use, which is a good reflection of many other things, the footprint we stamp on the planet collectively has increased roughly 50-fold in that span of time. And I apologize for the slightly out-of-date 2003 for this, but it's not, the relative things aren't very greatly changed, and the way WWF presented it last time I saw it, I don't think is as lucid as this. What this is an attempt to show by area of the world, and reading across from your left to your right, it's the North America, Canada and the USA. The dark blue one is the EU 23, and the lighter blue one is the other EU countries that some have since joined and others would like to. The green one is the Middle East and Central Asia. The red one is Latin America and the Caribbean. The really big green one is Asia Pacific, which is China and India and Philippines, and then Africa is the yellow one on the end. And the dotted lines, the height of each of those curves is the average footprint per person. And I'm not going to go into the details of how you calculate that, which are pretty dodgy, as are so many of these things. But on the other hand, I'm going to make a comparison of what one thinks the planet could sustain, and it contains the same dodgy elements, so that the comparison of these figures, which are pretty soft numbers, are compared with like by like in a moment. So the height gives the average footprint per person, and the width gives the number of people, and the total area, the total impact. You can see, for example, that both the Asian, the China-India bit, and the North America bit, the footprint per person exceeds what that area can sustain. In the case of North America, it's basically the footprint per person rather than the number of people. In the case of Asia, it's not the footprint per person, which is much lower, it's just the number of persons. And then there are places, perhaps surprisingly, Europe, and at least the EU part of Europe, has a footprint which is something twice that it could sustain, although the accession countries less so, and so on. The interesting thing is to compare that against the calculation of what is the overall footprint being stamped on the planet, taking all those rather variegated patterns in different places. It's been steadily rising, and put it against what is estimated to be sustainable. And as I say, some of the errors or some of the uncertainties, if you were to try and put error bars on these, they'd be two broad bands, but this is in a sense the center of a very wide probability distribution, with some of the errors cancelling, and it suggests that we're already past that point we've already succeeded the sustainable capacity. Buried within it are a wealth of fascinating ethical questions. And the average Australian, for example, has a footprint of 7.8 in the units that are used, which coincidentally is exactly half the biological capacity per person in that country. Conversely, in Egypt, the average person's footprint is much smaller than the Australians, but it's 4 times what that country alone can sustain. And the world average is, it's a more recent figure, is continuing to creep up to requiring sort of 1.3 planets. So how did we get to this point? Why did we get to this point? We began, for most of humanity's history, we've been small bands of hunter-gatherers, and that's what we were for a couple of 100,000 years. The beginnings of agriculture, independently in 2 or 3 different places, in the Middle East and also in parts of China, and began roughly all around the same time, roughly, and very roughly, 10,000 years ago. And once that happened, and it enabled the beginning of larger groups and more settled groups, the first towns, the first cities, and populations started to increase at a much faster rate. Even so, the increase was relatively slow for most of those 10,000 years compared to what began to happen as our understanding of how the world worked and our ability to modify it to our convenience really gathered pace in the aftermath of the scientific industrial revolution in the 1700s. And humanity attained its first billion. More recently, the explosive growth just in the last 50, 60 years is due to the fact that it's only in the last 100 years or so that we've had a really effective medicine based on real understanding. And even then, it's only in the last 50 years or so that that's been disseminated more generally outside the more privileged parts of the world. It's interesting to look at patterns of survival throughout this time. This is one that shows the survivorship curve in the sense of all the people who are born, what is the chance of surviving to be 10 years old, 20 years old, 80 years old? And this figure is deduced indirectly from remnants of skeletons left of hunter-gatherers in caves and the like. It is hard to imagine in a way. It basically says of all the kids that were born, half of them were dead before they were 5. But even more surprising, once you'd survived that first bit, the survivorship curve is more like what an ecologist would call type 2. It's more like birds. Your chance of surviving year to year is independent of how old you are. So the chance of, as it were, in your teens surviving from 16 to 17 is not very different from your chance of surviving from 80 to 81. 50 years ago, things looked rather different, even in the developing world, but the contrast by that time was remarkable. And this shows the survivorship curve from a typical developed country on top. I think it's Sweden, where most people who were born lived out their biblically promised 70 years and 10. But the lower curve is a typical developing country, specifically I think Uganda, and you see of the kids that were born, about a third were dead by the age of 5, but beyond that's better than the hunter-gatherers, and the curve, while it's still all through life things are risky, it's got more of a hump in it. It's not just flatlining downwards. Within that, however, there's a huge amount of variation, and it's hard for us to remember or even recognize just what things were like in the cities of the Industrial Revolution in the middle 1800s. The mortality rates there were not very different from what we saw for hunter-gatherers. Look at Liverpool in the 1860s. Half the kids that were born were dead by the age of 5, and you've got a type 2 survivorship curve. Quite extraordinary. All in all, however, this is the pattern that we have seen since population growth really began to gather pace. And just to give you an idea of what I mean when I say gather pace, the doubling time for human populations to build from hunter-gatherer populations, when we were humans, we were probably in total somewhere around 20 million. Maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less. And to get to the numbers that we were round about 10,000 years ago, the population was doubling on overall average something like once every 2,000 years. It took, as I said a moment ago, to 1830 to the early 1800s to get to the first billion. The population then doubled in the next century, and it doubled again in 40 years, and since then to bring us to now, its doubling rate is slowed down. It's more like 52 years. And what you see in this, 1750 through to the early 1900s, there's slow growth in the solid bars are the number of people being born that year, and the black line is the total number of people. You see, the survivorship is not all that it could be, and it's climbing slowly. Big change past 1950. This is the combination of medicine really being helpful, more or less for the first time to a rough approximation, and becoming more widely disseminated. And as you go forward from 1950, the developing world is getting more of the benefits, and the net result, as childhood survival gets better in the developing world, is that the birth rates begin to come down. But of course there are so many people now that it's still climbing. Just another way of driving this point home. The average life expectancy at birth 60 years ago was 46 years, and it's changed by 18 years to the turn of the century, and that's hard to relate to until you recognize that the average life expectancy gap between the developing and the developed world 50 years ago was 26 years, and it shrunk by 10 years ago to a still disgraceful 12. But remembering Liverpool, it's well to keep in mind that the developing world today is better off than the West was in the peak of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. And that's the figures I just said. It took us to 1830 to get the first billion, doubled in a century, doubled in 40 years, and we're looking at 9 billion maybe, more or less. And that's a softish number. It depends how things go. If current fertility trends, and I'd be curious, how many people in the room are aware that the current fertility average around the world is that the average woman is having one child, one female child? How many people are aware of that? I'm not surprised. That's an astonishing statistic, and it's happened really quite quickly. But even so, we're building on that much bigger base you saw. It's the momentum of population growth, of the great surge of the last 50 years. So if those fertility rates, which are at replacement level, persist, we'll be 9.1 billion by 2050. If people have half a child fewer, we may get in under 8 billion. If they have half a child more, it'll be that, 10.6. And if the current simple replacement, so it's not a growth fertility rate, it's just simple replacement along with the momentum of population growth, 11.7. So, but the 9 billion is assuming that the downward trend is going to continue. What's caused this downward trend? The most important single thing is educating women and giving them non-coercive access to fertility control. Here is a statistic from 6 developing countries, and you can read from that the average girl that completes primary school is going to have 1.5 fewer kids on average. And the average girl that completes primary school is going to have 3.5 fewer kids. And there aren't enough girls completing secondary school to get any really meaningful, going on to tertiary to get any meaningful statistics. But education is a big thing. But it also has to have access to fertility control. And it is my understanding, I don't know whether the legislation has been repealed, but I don't think it has, and depending on how things go, it's very unlikely to be. You are probably aware that overseas aid from the United States may not be spent on dissemination of condoms or indeed any advice on fertility control. I think that's one of the most shocking statements you can make about any country in the developing world. And this is finally wrapping that all up. This is starting at the top with the position in 1970, and it's females on your right and males on the left. And the red core is, this axis is numbers of people, and going upwards is age. So if you looked at the age profile in relation to education in 1970, the red bit is people who never finished primary school. The yellow bit is people who never finished secondary school. Sorry, the red bit is people who never went to primary school. The yellow bit is people with primary school. The blue bit is secondary school. And the tiny little dark blue bits are the negligible number of people who had tertiary education. That had changed. Many more people, of course, but you can see the red is narrowing and the yellow is expanding and the blue is expanding, and you're even getting a bit of dark blue, and that's now 2010. And the final one is an optimistic projection into the future of the number of people who have only secondary, much less none, is shrinking, and the rest is expanding. And that will, if these educated women have control over their life and access non-coercively to fertility control, that is the basis for projecting 9 million by 2050. Okay, so what are the things we should be worrying about, apart from the fact that there are more people in terms of more impact? Well, one of the problems is that 95% of the build-out increase in numbers, in particular in areas in developing countries, is going to occur in more people in cities. There's nothing wrong with cities as such, but it's an interesting pattern, and it would be an unfamiliar one to a time traveller from the 1700s who popped down here. The fraction of the human population that were in big cities in the 1700s was about 10%. It was about a quarter 100 years ago. Today it's just maybe last year, maybe next year, it's gone past 50%, and the projection for 2050 is to be 2/3. And the reason why that's a bit of a problem is many of the diseases that afflict us today were not present in hunter-gatherers. Things like measles need dense population, that are a population of people who one way or another are in contact that's in excess of at least 500,000, and hunter-gatherers never had the population to sustain that. It is also interesting, the estimate for that first 10,000 years post-agricultural revolution, as one moved up to the 1700s and science really began to have an effect, the first half of those 5,000 years, the human population grew faster than in the second half. And the reason was the number of new infections that need large populations to persist were now able to establish themselves, and they came mainly from contacts, they're mainly derived from domestic animals, in much the way of some of the influenza things are today. A lot of people worry that this is one of the big problems of the future, and I thought, just so that I wouldn't seem to be hopelessly pessimistic, this is not, as it turns out, one of the things that worries me, even though there are contemporary examples of really nasty things that have hopped into the human population from non-human animals, and largely as a result of more people and more contact between other creatures and ourselves. And in particular, the SARS epidemic is a really interesting one. The SARS epidemic that never happened by sheer good luck of one of the peculiarities of the infection, that the time between becoming symptomatic and becoming infectious is very short. Otherwise, we probably would have had much more problem with it. But you were able to catch it quick enough. But that was a phenomenon of what might be called the industrialization of the bushmeat trade, with the growth of prosperous restaurants in southern China, prompting a trade of harvesting animals so that people could eat exotic things. And that is one area of conservation concern that's not really well studied, but is indeed interesting. Well, the reason I don't worry so much about that is most people think our current medicine is really the ant's pants, and it is. It does wonderful things for us, but it's still got quite a way to go. In particular, to air one of the bees in my bonnet, most people don't realize that most of the vaccines we actually have and use, we hit upon largely accidentally. And when it comes to something novel and tricky like HIV, or something that's where the agent itself counter-adapts to the attack you make on it, we're not so good at producing a vaccine. And one of my beliefs is that we may not get an HIV vaccine until we have really understood the nonlinear dynamics of the process, whereby, although when you're initially infected, the body mounts an effective response to the first strain, but then there's an escape mutant, and the body deals with that, and so there's this quite long period from infection as things go on, and then eventually it gets to the point, not so much that the immune system's overwhelmed, but this curious dynamics of that system just means things break down. We've attacked that problem with great success simply by developing measures whereby you suppress viral replication. And we're now trying to think of ways where you could do that so effectively that you could maybe stop you could stop the thing spreading. But the idea that ever more intricate molecular description of the events that go on between the virus and the cell, brilliant though they are, will somehow lead you to an understanding of the very complicated nonlinear dynamics of the process, is one that most people who work in that area actually resent the suggestion that mathematics might play a part. And most people who work in that area are not actually aware that we still don't understand the pathogenesis of HIV. Well, that was a brief indulgence on my part. Setting that aside, I think we're going to get beyond that, and I think just as the ecology books up to the 50s just had no mathematics in them, and today they'll have a reasonable amount of theory underpinning stuff, so too you pick up an immunology text of today and it's all descriptive, brilliantly descriptive, but I make a prediction, 20 years from now, the immunology textbooks will be unrecognizable compared to today's. That's why I'm not so worried about infectious diseases. Second thing that we should be worrying about is supplies of food and water. It was in the 1980s that a group of people at Stanford made a necessarily imprecise estimate of just how much of the green stuff that grew on the planet each year was taken directly or indirectly to our purposes. And they suggested a number with a rather spurious degree of precision of 40%. I always thought of it as somewhere between a quarter and a half or so. But interestingly, more recently, there's been a very elaborate study simply of land from using satellite imagery of land which has been disturbed, and this disturbed, you assume that's us who did it, and it turns out to be around 40%. That's quite a thing. But even more dramatic, I think, of all the green stuff that grew last year, from the poles to the equator, I mean, green living things, all of you and all the grass are all basically the same composition. All living things are made up, to first approximation, of hydrogen, carbon and oxygen in the ratio 2 to 1 to 1. Big complicated molecules. Then at the level of about 1% is nitrogen, and down another factor of the general order of 5 to 10, phosphorus. That's the top 5. Round the world last year, of all the atoms of nitrogen that were incorporated into green plant material, more than half came from artificial fertilizers. That's an extraordinary statement. And they underpin this production, and they have, I mean, it's good that we can do things so efficiently. I mean, we've done some things very well indeed with the Green Revolution, that where our ability to feed people has increased at a faster rate than people have increased, although it's coming up against limits now. So there are some good things we've done, but again, the question arises as to the sustainability. One of the questions for sustainability of agriculture, sustainability against an increasing population, and is water supplies. Roughly round the planet, 70% of water use is in agriculture, and this is a thing from the Hydrological Institute in Oxford, near Oxford, down the river from Oxford near Wallingford. And it's an estimate of what's the rising demand for water since 1900 projected forward to 2060. What's the ultimate available water resource, in principle, the blue line, and how is that that's how it was pristine, how has it been declining as a loss from various things, from destruction of watersheds, pollution and other things. And it does seem to me, again, one shouldn't be too pessimistic about that, because if we were cleverer, we could get rid of that. But the demand thing is going to keep rising. This estimate suggests we're going to run into the point where demand exceeds supply somewhere around 2040. And yet again, it's an estimate that could be wrong, easily wrong, 20 years one way or the other. But it again puts us within the limits that we ought to be worrying about. In some ways, this slide should have been before the one I just showed, but doesn't matter. Again, from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, if I turn to the impact of this on natural ecosystems and the plants and animals that inhabit them, this is an attempt to assess how much habitat for plants and animals has been lost under various suppositions, and the colour coding on this is the overall length of each of those things, whether they're Mediterranean forest or tropical grasslands, is just a measure of the original volume, normalized to 1, of those things on the planet when we were at low density. And the green bits are the bits that were still there after 1990, if my memory is correct. I've been going faster than I've been turning the pages. Yes, to 1990. So the white stuff is what was lost, sometimes quite a while ago, sometimes more recently, up to 1990. There are some places where we've actually regained some of the stuff that's lost since 1990 in temperate grasslands and woodlands, but more commonly, we've lost more of it, particularly in those 4 lower boxes. So the creatures and plants in those habitats are facing threats thus from habitat loss. Many of them are facing threats from over-exploitation, over-harvesting. And yet a third category of threat is alien invasions, movement of things round the world that come in and make for all sorts of a mess. So there are a variety of threats to the biological heritage we have. This one way of illustrating them in a rather emotional way is this corner of the Bronx Zoo In fact, one of my ex-graduate students, who was the deputy director at the time, put in this cemetery of tombstones for species that are certifiably extinct. The interesting thing about them, they are without exception all birds or mammals. These are the upper class of animals, and they get their proper recognition and attention. We don't know nearly as much as we should about the creatures and the plants that are there, much less the rate at which they're going extinct. To begin with, and this is not this slide, we don't even know how many species there are. We don't even know how many distinct species we've named and recorded in our museums. The reason we don't know that, you may say, that's impossible. If we've named and recorded, we know it. Yes, but because so many of, I can tell you exactly how many books there are in the Library of Congress to a given date. But for these individual collections, I can even tell you how many things in the Star catalogue. They've been computerized. But the catalogues of individual museums are in the process. It's getting better, but they've not been harmonized in such a way that there are many things that have been independently discovered and given different names by different people. And it's not surprising, quite a not trivial number of beetle species in the British Museum are known from one specimen. And quite a few are known from only one site, and it's quite a lot of work to key those things out. So even for the things that are known, we're uncertain to within 10% or so, and even as we're uncovering past synonyms, we're creating new ones. But when it comes to how many there actually are, plausible estimates range, I think, defensible estimates from something like 2 million to something like 10 million, and I would put it narrower in the range 3 to 4. And people can argue about it. When you talk about extinction, you will get people who use rather simplistic mathematical estimates of how much area species need and stuff, and say really deeply foolish and potentially embarrassing things like, this year we have lost 27,000 species. And I know one of my colleagues who was in the habit of saying that until one day somebody stood up and said, could you name one? Yeah. Now, this is an attempt from the red data books on categories of endangerment to ask what fraction of, and we do know some things really well. We resonate particularly with birds and mammals. They sort of look like us a bit. They have a disproportionate number of taxonomists and systematists engaged with them. And that's I could go off in another ramble for a quarter of an hour on that. But this is an estimate of the number of known species in the taxon of mammals and vertebrates, what percentage are threatened, as distinct from the ones that you have really systematically evaluated and you think are threatened. And of course, it's a tricky statistic because you're going to tend to systematically evaluate the ones that you think might be threatened. It also tells you a lot about, just very quickly, taxonomists, as best we can determine, are roughly divided 1/3 on vertebrates, 1/3 on plants, and 1/3 on everything else, which does not map into the number in each of those things. And particularly interesting is the fraction of all known species of insects, of which there are something variously estimated, but around 1 million, are threatened with extinction. And the suggestion was that it's 0.06%, although it's most of 3/4 of the ones that have been evaluated, but they're a non-random pick. And of the ones that are certified as in danger, that's 73 known insects. If my memory is right, 42 are Hawaiian Drosophila. So that tells you a lot about the genetics industry, but it also tells you that we know absolutely damn all about the endangered species of lots of things. Even so, in that fog, there is one way you can do something that I don't think is altogether silly, although it's a bit controversial. You can say we really do know fairly well mammals and birds. There are about 10,000 species of birds and 4,000 or 5,000 species of mammals. And those are things where the extinctions by and large are picked up. And it's run in the last century at about 1 a year from that total group. So that doesn't sound like many. 1 a year. If you're one of those species, you're playing a game of Russian roulette each year with a revolver that has roughly 14,000 chambers. So on average, if you play that game each year, your life expectancy is about 10,000 years. Well, I'd settle for that, but I mean, in terms of if you're a mammal or a bird species, the question is, how long are the characteristic time of species in the fossil record from origination to extinction? And that's a very difficult question to answer because, first of all, sometimes it is they originated and then there was an event like the Permian-Jurassic boundary and the lineage just ended. Sometimes there's something like the evolution of the horse, as it was sort of relay and replacement, and the things weren't really going extinct, they were just changing form. Nonetheless, I don't think it's altogether silly to try and get a handle on that by asking what's the average lifetime from origination to extinction in the fossil record of the average sort of species. And variously you can estimate that as somewhere in the neighborhood from 100,000 years to 10 million years, maybe more, maybe less for some. But whatever it is, it's certainly a hell of a lot longer than the average life expectancy at the moment of bird or mammal species. And that's why that has led to this not approved by all the people who are whose profession, who I would say have hidden embarrassments about their profession's lack of getting to grips with the issues, but I didn't say that. It's an attempt to suggest, just independent of which species you're talking about, what's the extinction rate overall, and if birds and mammals are typical, and maybe they're not. There's no reason to, I don't think there's a reason to assume they are grossly different, but maybe they are. But if they're representative, then things are set to speed up in such a way that it's not unreasonable to say we're on the breaking tip of a 6th great wave of extinction in the history of life on Earth. All of this has implications for a whole set of things that natural systems do for us that we don't count in conventional GDP. And another thing that the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, in all its imperfection, it's still better than nothing. It has tried to classify these services, and it classifies them under 25 headings. And some of them are forest systems, some of them are dry land, some of them, that classification is by place. You could also classify them by the sorts of things they're doing, pollinating, providing breeding grounds for fish, and so like mangroves and so on. There's an attempt in each case to ask, are these on average, this particular system declining under the stresses of habitat change, as we saw, of deforestation, climate change, invasive species, overexploitation, or just pollution? Is it remaining roughly the same? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And the overall answer is that of those 24 categories, 15 are getting worse, 4, mainly assumed with agriculture, are actually getting better, and 5 you just don't know enough to say anything. And the one problem that was foreshadowed 100 years ago and is looming larger today is that all these problems of habitat destruction and the like are being further made difficult by changes in the weather that is, or in the climate rather, that is being initiated, began sometime in the 1780s, a characteristic time, and in fact, I'm not sure whether they actually passed the resolution or whether it's still informal of the Geological Society deciding that we've entered a new era, the Anthropocene, that dawned in 1780. But we have been putting increasingly large quantities of fossil carbon into the atmosphere, and as I say, it was predicted well over a century ago that that would have effects. On the other hand, the atmosphere is a hugely complicated dynamical system, and many of the things that we would like to say about it with precision, we can only put within very broad error bars. If you want to dramatize it, but I think it's a bit unfair to dramatize it, we're currently putting back into the atmosphere each year roughly 1 million years worth of fossil fuel carbon sequestered. 80% of it from fossil fuels, 20% of it, and that's not biomass for energy. I mean, that's just cutting down trees, most of it, and taking and burning them. The 7% nuclear, this is 2 years old, is probably going down, maybe down towards 6%, and all the renewables, hydro, wind, geothermal, are probably getting up around 4%. And that is having consequences. Why did agriculture begin about 10,000 years ago? If you look at the past climate on a long time scale, in ways which are fairly well understood and have to do with perturbations in the orbits of the Earth in respect to the Sun largely and other events, if you go back beyond 10,000 years, we were in a period of glacial cycles, but that had in earlier times been periods of steadiness. For most of the tendency of post-agricultural humanity, for most of the past 10,000 years, the climate has been oddly steady, and certainly for the last 1,000 years where we have good data. There are those who would argue that that's an interaction, that the beginnings of agriculture helped really stabilize the climate. I don't find that very persuasive, but it's certain that it won't, even if we continued, if we stopped putting fossil fuel into the atmosphere, on the time scale of thousands of years, people are going to have a problem with the climate naturally. But the problem we're having now is not something that's natural. It is unambiguously associated with what we've done. It's hard to make definitive statements of the rates at which things will happen in particular places, and it's tempting to generalize from concatenations of extreme events which have accelerated that that's necessarily all due to climate change. And my own view would be a lot of it is due to the fact that the climate is changing, but there are lots of areas of uncertainty in this. But it's equally my view that we'd be really bloody stupid to just assume we can go on doing what we're doing and hope that it's all a coincidence. That's what we're seeing. This, I find, many people, maybe some of you won't, many people find this persuasive. What this is major area by major area of the land surface. It shows what the climate, the temperature has actually done over the last century, 1900 to 2000, and what is the ensemble prediction of the leading climate models, which have subtly different assumptions, and that's the pinkish areas, and then with the same models but leaving out the additional carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere, what you'd predict, which are the bluish things. And whereas the models agree with what's happened broadly, if you put in climate change, if you put the burning fossil fuel into the models, and they don't if you don't. The economic analysis of this, interestingly, done by Nicholas Stern and tweaked a bit more recently by a person whose name I'm having a senile moment about, who was the provost at Yale, and somebody will shout out his name. No? Well, if you read the New York Review of Books, there's a very good article by this person. And the suggestion is, yes, it's going to cost to do things about it, but it's going to cost a hell of a lot more not to do things about it. The estimated cost, for example, of doing something about it is perhaps 1% or 2% of GDP by 2050. The estimated cost of not doing something about it is more like 15% of GDP by 2050. That's why in Britain we have legislation now that commits the government to a set of targets to bring our output of carbon dioxide down by a factor of about 5. And it is feasible if one really works on it. The key thing is one has to decarbonize electricity. All of these things come together. More people, more impact per person, impacts of different kinds. Climate change, one of them, but only one of them. This is not some touchy-feely, greeny slide. This is a slide produced by the UK Ministry of Defence. And what it shows in colour-coded ways are areas of the globe which are under stress from water shortages, from too many people for the habitat to support, from declining crops for various reasons, or simply from not enough food being available, or most difficult to get a really accurate, reliable impression of what's going to happen, coastal flooding. And you can see it, the coastal flooding doesn't tend to correlate with, and then recent major conflicts, which are what the big asterisks are and what MOD was interested in. The coastal flooding doesn't correlate well with conflict, but the other things do correlate exceedingly well. So that brings me to the final part of this discussion, and I should have got here 5 minutes earlier. What are we going to do about it? The problem here is that, and this is where I am in the habit, I've made myself quite unpopular on the Climate Change Committee by keeping saying the really important science here is the behavioural science. And there's no question in my mind but that for many, many different reasons is the most important science. I sometimes, just as the social scientists are all getting terribly happy, can't help saying it's a pity there aren't better people in the subject. But it's rather unkind and gratuitous. The problem itself of getting people to act, particularly to act on behalf of what still seems a distant future, to go along with I will, to try and stop I will if you will, shading into I won't because you won't, is not an easy problem to solve. It has its origins actually, and it goes right back to Darwin. In his own time, Darwin had 3 really big problems. In that classic Wilberforce-Huxley debate, if Soapy Sam Wilberforce had actually done his homework, he could have wiped the floor with Huxley. 3 problems. People didn't know anything about nuclear forces, and with electromagnetic and forces and gravity, the sun couldn't burn. You couldn't explain the sun having been around for more than a few million years. So you didn't have the age that you needed. Darwin answered that by simply taking all references to actual spans of time in terms of numbers out of the subsequent editions of the Origin of Species. Second problem was, the belief at that time was that inheritance was by blending the characteristics of mother and father. And under that kind of blending inheritance, as was pointed out to Darwin, you couldn't preserve the variability which is the essential ingredient upon which natural selection works to produce evolution. And despite the fact that Mendel had done at the same time the experiments that showed inheritance is particulate. I mean, that's a very elegant example of the need for mathematics in biology. None of the people in either Darwin's or Agassiz or anybody else's circle had the mathematics to recognize that what Mendel had done is show that inheritance was particulate. And it wasn't until 50 years later that Hardy and Weinberg proved the Hardy-Weinberg theorem that says in the absence of selective force, all forces, mutation, selection, statistical drift, gene frequencies will remain unaltered, which is sort of like Newton's first law of mechanics. Again, counterintuitive that bodies remain stationary or in straight line unless there are forces. There always are forces. But Hardy-Weinberg, and I mention it for the last thing I'm going to do. I'm going to come forward from that. The third problem for Darwin, but that was cured. But the third problem is still with us. Why do aggregates of the members of a population cooperate? Why do they do favors to other people that are costly to themselves? And one example, prairie dogs live in small colonies, and the males take it in turn to give alarm calls, standing up on a mound, and marmots do it too, and you'll see them sometimes when you're walking. They're putting themselves at risk. But they take it in turns, and when they're not doing it, they have a benefit that is far bigger than the risk. So simplistically, you might say, well, there's no problem. It's obvious. It's a sensible thing to do. However, it is susceptible to the cheating marmot or the cheating prairie dog that doesn't do it and gets the benefit without the cost. And they literally have an evolutionary advantage because insofar as there's any correlate between behavior and genes, they're going to have more of their genes in the next population because they were less likely, they didn't run the risk that the sentinels run. You can get around that if you start asking that about us. And this is still an open question in my view. A really satisfactory answer to that problem we still don't have. While we were hunter-gatherers, we were small bands of closely related people. But once we started settling in cities, then we had a bigger problem. Now when I say it's still an unsolved problem, there is a huge growth industry in academia. Most major universities, Oxford has one, Harvard has one, has a resource you can go to whereby undergraduates will play games with money, with small sums of money. And public goods games, they're called. Many of you will be familiar with them. They're things like you're each given $20, and there are 10 of you. And you're each given $10, and there are going to be 10 rounds of the game. If at the end of the 10 rounds there is $100 in the kitty, then everybody can keep their remaining money. They're given $20. I think I've got it right. And anyhow, what it's meant to be is if everybody every time played fair, at the end of the thing, everybody would have half what they started with. But the temptation is there to cheat and not do it and hope other people will make up for it so that at the end of it, you'll all be successful and you'll walk away with more than half. I suspect if it's played at places like Harvard or Oxford, people just want to win more than the others because that's the sort of people they are. I'm sure that's what I'd do. Fascinating what comes out of these things. Typically, what happens is some people cheat, they fall behind, then toward the end they realize they've got to play catch up, but more than half the time they don't get there. There are various, then, refinements on these games. You let it be identified who cheated, and then other players can punish you. They can pay a small sum to punish you for having cheated. And that's really amusing when that happens. First of all, depending on the people playing it, they'll get locked into cooperation or not. And there's one classic study which did it in different cities. And you'll be gratified to know that the people in Boston, Nottingham, and Melbourne, US, Australia, Britain, quickly converged on cooperation. Others didn't do it so quickly, and in Athens and Muscat, it was so extreme that people, when people were punished, you also identified the punisher, and they just get pissed off at the punisher, and they'd then punish them for punishing them, and the whole thing would dissolve, and everybody, they were halfway through the game, they'd all thrown away all their money, punishing each other. It's really fascinating. There are other amusing things you could do. One of my colleagues and I decided what one ought to do. None of these games until recently had the initial people, if you really want to mimic climate change, where some of them had more money than the others to start with. And people could only win if it ended up that everybody had the same amount of money. So the people who started out with more money had to put more money in. And that doesn't work out quite so well. And another kind of study that came accidentally out of this thing that I did with Stu West and a student, it turns out that women are trained in cooperation much faster than men, which is something that I find not at all surprising, but I found it really strange that people had only recently started to look at that. And incidentally, digressing shamelessly back to finance, there is a wonderful study of people who invest the family money. And it considered 4 categories: single women, single men, married couples where the man invests the money, married couples where the woman invests the money. And of course, the reason I'm saying this, you can guess the answer. The best performers are single women, followed by couples where the woman invests, followed by couples where the man invests, with the worst of the lot being the kind of people who are running the city. Anyhow, why am I saying all of this? I'm saying all of this because, and I'm going to read the last bit, and I know I'm running over time, but there we are. My own speculation about how cooperative human societies evolved is both less academic and analytic and more gloomy. Once we move out of the mists of prehistory, we find stories of dreamtime, creation myths, ceremonies and initiation rites, spirits and gods, with a unifying theme that all seek simultaneously to help explain the external world, but also to provide a stabilization matrix for a cohesive society. There are striking and unexplained similarities in belief systems and rituals from different times and different places. When the Catholic friars first came across the sacrifice of the Aztecs, they saw it as an obscene parody of their own taking the wine and water. Conscience, a simple word for a complex concept which helps foster behavior in accord with society's professed norms, has memorably been defined by Mencken as the inner voice which warns us that somebody might be looking. And how helpful it is if that somebody is an all-seeing, all-knowing supernatural entity, so that the punisher in the game is not someone you can round back on, but someone who is detached from the game. Common to all these conjectured stabilizing forces in essentially all earlier societies are hierarchical structures serving and interpreting the divine being or pantheon, along with unquestioning respect for authority. In such systems, faith trumps evidence. That's the price you pay for the glue that works. But if there is any substance in that idea about how we solve this problem, how cooperative behavior has evolved and been maintained in human societies, it could be really bad news. Because although such authoritarian systems can be quite good at preserving social coherence in an orderly society, they are by the same token not good at adapting to change. I mean, Jared Diamond's book is a nice series of case studies, but the reason I mentioned a moment ago that the Hardy-Weinberg theorem is sort of like Newton's first law, there's another theorem in biology that's not thought of that way, but it's really like Newton's second law. Newton's second law, having told you if there are no forces, nothing happens, he then went on to tell you F equals ma and how forces do produce change in dynamics. There is also in biology, just as I think the Hardy-Weinberg law is a sort of biology's first law, there's a thing called Fisher's fundamentals theorem, which is a fascinating thing that is sort of is really quite analogous to Newton's second law, and it says that a population's potential rate of change of gene frequency, which measures its ability to adapt to changing circumstances, is proportional to the variance in gene frequency, which will, on the other hand, the variability in gene frequencies within the population is going to be small if essentially all the individuals are optimally adapted to their present circumstance. So there is actually an inherent tension between, on the one hand, having variability so you can adapt, and on the other hand, not having it so that you can all be the best phenotype. So if there's any substance in those speculations that I've just aired to you about the answer to Darwin's problem in explaining cooperation in human societies, I think it rests on that sort of tension. And it could be that those same forces that enabled advanced societies, that promoted cohesion and everybody agreeing on everything, are not at all good for responding to a changing world. And it could even be argued that the recent rise of fundamentalism in both East and West is an illustration of this meta-level version of Fisher's fundamental theorem, as complex faiths, complex, increasingly through the years, compassionate faiths, are reduced to intolerant ideologies to resist the challenge of societal change. And if that is true, it is an unfortunate conclusion. And I said right at the beginning I was going to end by coming back to Murray's idea of thinking of other worlds. Celebrating Darwin's centenary in Cambridge, they had a big thing for the 150th a couple of years ago, and 2 speeches after dinner. Martin Rees gave a very nice speech about what we were learning about the worlds, the stars out there, with particular emphasis on the fact that we were have the capacity to see planets, and increasingly we may get the capacity to see other planets that are like ours. And I abandoned the speech I was going to give and said I thought that was absolutely fascinating question, because really the question of our time as we confront really serious problems of too many people, and yet the things we ought to be doing to help educate them and make available fertility control are being resisted by fundamentalist religion on the right in this country as much as in the Middle East. Let me just say, by way of conclusion, it would be nice if I was the speech at the thing. I said, it's very interesting to contemplate if some of these planets will be kind of habitable. And the really interesting question we're going to have to ask of them, against our background of the challenges we face, and which we don't look like doing a good job with, is, are we on a trajectory that is common to most inhabited planets, just as our mathematics and our same sorts of laws? Are there others out there that are started ahead of us that have gone down this road and not solved the problem? Or are some of them got Dr. Spock on board, as it were, and we're able to transcend the irrationalities that are part of everyday life and see their problem and get together to solve it? And that's a really interesting question. Are the problems soluble? And if we knew more about all those planets, and it's a different problem from the one about mathematics and science. They're ultimately related, and it's an even more important problem, and it's indeed, in its essence, the problem that lies at the heart of why it is that the behavioral sciences are the sciences that we are going to have to depend on and to save us. Yeah. I should say I'm happy to answer questions. I'm sorry I ran over time, and anybody who feels they should want to go certainly should feel free to walk out. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about day-to-day behavior. Like, Priuses are expensive, right? And so, if you want to talk about that kind of day-to-day thing, that's kind of that's where the details are, as far as I think. Where one place where the details are for solving the problem long term, right? Repeat the question. Oh. I'll try to be really loud. My question is, with regarding behavior, how do we make choices day to day that work towards solving the problem? I know that's not complete, and you can't do it.
Well, some of the things that, and I thought you were saying, some of the, for example, cars that are more fuel efficient are also maybe more expensive. One way you can get around that, and all of this is at heart, I think, has to be sticks and carrots. You have to, as again has happened in Britain, the government car fleet is largely Prius now. You can do things like that. Some of the things that you can prompt people to do are actually going to save them money, as well as simply being more careful of turning lights out all the time, simply asking yourself whether you need to do this particular thing or that particular thing. One of the ways, I mean, this was an invitation to get into all the sorts of things that we're thinking about trying to do. Simply getting into kids in primary school and having this part of what they're learning about, in the hope that that will then influence. There are lots of things you can do, and they don't all cost. Some of them are more costly. I'm surprised, one of the things that I was quite surprised about, you're seeing a mushrooming of solar panels in Oxford. And that's partly there is a tariff scheme to encourage people to do it, but at the same time it's not something that's actually going to save you money. And I find it rather astonishing that in Santa Fe, where it's a much more suitable place to be having solar panels, they haven't caught on. And I'm curious as to whether this is aesthetic or what.
Yeah, I had a question, and I also thought about this last night in terms of financial systems versus individual banks. But in the past, cultures, generally speaking, that have living religions, you could talk about them as having a collective ego. So they acted as a single unit, and their whole culture was devised towards initiation, the creation of adopting everybody into that single collective unit. Whereas nowadays, obviously, we have a large population with individual egos, and the different societies have different levels of collectivity versus individual ego. But the individual ego obviously is driven by its own needs and desires, and one by one, so we have millions of individual egos rather than a single collective society. Now, if there's an inherent tension or even conflict between a society that has a bunch of individual egos and a society that has a single collective ego with a culture and a religion that supports that, and they're mutually exclusive. And there's not been anywhere in history that we know of, except maybe in Greece, that there was such a dynamic of all these individual egos, and we're forward to try to decrease this tension. I mean, it may be that the individual egos are partly creating the problem, where the collective ego, the problem didn't exist, and there was a bunch of keep the question short.
Yeah.
The tension between individual egos and a collective society with a collective ego.
I'm simply going to duck the question and say it's an interesting idea. Sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but
Take one last question.
yeah.
Relevant to the question the person over here who brought up, which is interesting. A recent, I'm just repeating what is in a recent book by Edward O. Wilson called the Social Conquest of the Earth. And he speaks of this business of group. We would call it individual versus group egos. We'll talk about a group ego. If you had a pure group ego, pure altruistic group, you'd have an ant colony. And if you had one where individual selection and selfishness dominated, you'd have no group at all. So somewhere the conflict between individual selection and group selection seems to maintain a balance in there, and there's no solution. He claims, I don't know, he claims there's no solution to the problem.
Well, I'm very reluctant to believe there isn't a solution, but I do think that to get people to come together to act on behalf of a seemingly distant future in a collective way where people all take their fair share is quite a problem. And I do see in many ways working, I'm not a religious person myself, but I grew up in the Presbyterian church and I lived my social life through it and so on. And it basically did a lot of good things, and it had a collective, cohesive sort of subscription to a set of values that you didn't have to accept the entire infrastructure to see. So I am basically of the view that religion is a very large part of a potential answer, but equally, what I was trying, being so self-indulgent as to err, is this worry I have that I've not seen expressed in that way, that there's just an inherent contradiction in it, because the way that the thing works is such that when you put it under stress, it wants to respond by sort of going back to core values, and there is this inherent tension, just as there is in other circumstances, between the well, I've said it once already and I won't go through it again.